Good morning. This is being recorded on February 7th, and I would allow me a small preface before I get into the meat of the discussion. For those of you who know me, you know I am not a tech person, nor a science person. I have, a hard time coping with the technology, computers, and all of that. But oddly, I've been interested in science and technology and policy since maybe 1964 as a way of getting into political questions that I and others might be interested in. For example, the capacity of governments, the capacity of intergovernmental organizations, the spin-offs from colonial period and institutions and so forth. And ironically, nowadays, for example, when it's talking about the difficulty of distributing the vaccines, let's say in Africa, because many of them need cold storage and the cold storage is not available. And it might amuse you to learn that in 1965, I was running around Africa looking at veterinary matters in order to gauge the questions I just mentioned to you. And one of the things I looked at was rinderpest campaign. It's a cattle disease. And in order for this cattle not to have the disease, they have to be vaccinated, but these vaccinations required cold storage and it wasn't available. And so in a funny kind of way, eons ago, dealing with cattle disease, the issues are not all that dissimilar in terms of the vaccines. In any event, that's not what I want to talk about today. What I do want to talk about is the questions of science and technology, mainly technology and warfare. And I tend to think about the new topics after I've recorded the previous topic. So I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks. And for those of you who are reading the New York Times Magazine yesterday, I just want to quote from it because it sort of steals my thunder. So allow me to read a sentence from the New York Times, which said, "Cyber weapons have changed international relations more profoundly than any advance since the advent of the atomic bomb. In some ways, they're even more profound and destabilizing." And that is my impression, and that is the thesis of today, which is that while we are watching all this mess in Ukraine, and as I record this, we still don't know whether Putin is going to move across the border or not and what he will do. We look at these tanks rolling and we look at the airplanes landing in Belarus and so forth. And it all looks like something we've grown up with, right? I mean, armies, tanks, airplanes, and so forth. When in point of fact, this is getting quite outdated. Much of the conflict in the world, much of the ability to influence governments and influence international relations is no longer really in the hands of governments and the traditional weapons, large armies, tanks, soldiers marching, and all the rest, but it's now become a factor of cyber and of one kind or another. I've talked about this a little bit more in a different context, but let me just run down all the things that are sort of new and now have a bearing on conflict and war. Drones, right? We recall that drones were even used in the Obama administration. Somebody can sit in Nevada and send drones to God knows where. They can destroy houses, people's lives, deaths, accidents, leaders, whatever. But it is kind of a clean warfare, right? It doesn't involve tanks and it doesn't involve soldiers out there getting shot or getting injured. What it does is people sitting in nice offices doing warfare across international borders. There's also, cell phones and cell phones communication. There are also cyber attacks and cyber. There are also satellites of one kind or another. In fact, yes, last week they were talking about that the Russians may nuclearize some of the satellites. That would be fun. So warfare is really changing in terms of the technology, and the technology that can be used both by governments, but also jihadists and individuals and individual groups. It can be used to destroy things nationally and internationally. And it's getting very, very dangerous. And what is really important is that warfare, by and large, used to be in the hands of governments. And increasingly, it is no longer in the hands of governments. Now, before I sort of, make the suggestion that governments don't play any role anymore, of course they can play a role because they can use all of these technologies in behest of government policies. But it's also the case that which of these technologies the governments can use has a lot, and how to use them, and what kind of havoc to visit upon in groups and individuals and states has a lot to do with the technology that is available for the governments. On the other hand, groups other than governments, and for that matter, tech industry, has a lot of control because they control the technology. That is to say, they can share them with governments, they can share them with individuals, they can share them with groups. And what you have then is, theoretically, and not so theoretically, you can have warfare, or what we would call warfare, massive destructions of infrastructure, of human lives, and so forth, without governments playing a role at all, being, in a sense, victimized by people inside their societies and outside their societies. So it's a new ballgame. And before I so set governments aside, it's also important to recognize that the development of these technologies that can be used in violence and destructive activities very often have a symbiotic relationship with governments. I don't want to dismiss governments' roles in this. For example, in the United States, there is a back and forth between people in the Defense Department and people in the tech industry and the arms industry, right? Somebody is in government, the US government, the Defense Department, they retire or they leave for other reasons, and they then become officials in the arms industry, in the tech industry, and vice versa. So that there is a give and take, not only in terms of the information, but in terms of the access of which of these technologies get developed, which are handed to governments to use, which are not handed to governments to use, which are secret, which are public. It is a very convenient relationship, a symbiotic relationship with governments like the United States, like France, like Israel, like other countries, between the arms industries and the governments. Now, the problem is not just that governments might be enabled using these new technologies, and that these new technologies, for example, drones, lead to very different consequences and don't necessarily require old-fashioned huge armies and so forth that we're seeing on television. But it's also that the technologies are able to engage in violence and conflict and bring down governments in states without state involvement necessarily. So if there's a group, let's say a jihadist group, that can acquire some of these new technologies, they are in a position to create chaos and havoc and to bring down governments. Conversely, leaders of governments, especially authoritarian leaders, are acquiring these technologies for themselves in order to control their own societies and other circumstances, other societies. And one of the things I've talked about before, which I want to spend a few minutes talking about, is because everybody's talking about it, is the famous NSO corporation in Israel, which has produced this Pegasus hardware, whatever it is, software, I guess it is, which allows dictators to have access to the telephones of everybody in their society that they want to. And as a consequence, arrest people, imprison people, control opposition groups, and on and on. And one of the things that this Israeli hardware has managed to do is to find itself into the lives of all the big authoritarian leaders in the world. Whether it's Orban in Hungary, whether it's Modi in India, whether it's even the left government of Mexico, whether it's Guatemala, whether it's Brazil, whether it's various dictatorships in Africa, all of these dictators, authoritarians, have acquired this technology, this Pegasus technology that is marketed by this Israeli company, and as a consequence, are managing to wrest control of their own societies and any opposition in a way that was totally impossible before this technology existed. It is of interest to note that the whole politics of the Middle East, which I will go back and talk about in subsequent session, has been influenced by this. That is to say, Israel is now in bed with the Emirates, with the Gulf states, with Morocco, with all the governments in the Middle East, which used to be in support of the Palestinians. They're not particularly interested in the Palestinians anyway, and they've now decided their relationship with Israel is more important. So Israel, remarkably, maybe not surprisingly, is playing a very major role in the lives of most of the dictators in the world because of its ability and its company's ability, and the government is in support of it. Netanyahu marketed this on behalf of the company. Israel is now a necessary and a good guy, and is in alliance with many, many governments that used to be its enemies, used to be the governments that supported Palestine, either actively or inactively. And they're now in alliance with Israel over this technology. And this technology has the capacity both inside those countries to dictate policies, dictate oppositions, change of governments, civil strife, sometimes jihadist groups, which are undesirable on their own, but also potential conflict and influence in countries outside of themselves. So this proliferation of this technology, Pegasus in particular, it has made very serious impact on the kind of world we live in, which we haven't fully acknowledged yet. And I think the New York Times is absolutely right. This technology, this cyber technology, and the modern use of cyber technology, and particularly this information Pegasus technology, has changed the nature of state power, but also is changing the nature of international politics. We don't understand this well enough. I mean, we understand that, all of a sudden some house and some people are killed by a drone, and innocent civilians, as in Afghanistan, might be killed. But we really don't understand to what extent the countries that have this technological power have the capacity to make war or create circumstances equivalent of war, namely takeover. One of the sort of vaguely surprising things about Putin and the Ukraine business is that Putin can bring Ukraine to an absolute standstill without using any arms. He can completely cut their access to energy and to any kind of communications if he wanted to. Right? This would be an absolute nightmare. People would be starving, people would be freezing to death, etc. That's in Russia's capability, right? And whoever starts this first is, starting a whole new way of warfare. Now, for whatever reasons, which don't need to detain us today, Putin seems to be wanting to at least partially use conventional ways to squeeze countries. But this other possibility also exists. And quite aside from the technological innovations which are creating new mechanisms for warfare and therefore international relations, that is to say, how you deal with other countries, how you prevent conflict, how we resolve conflict, the technology also has led to vulnerabilities, quite aside from the ones I just talked about, in other ways. Some of you who are fans of Rachel Meadows, who's about to go off the air, as a matter of fact, may know the story of the Irish and the Irish fishermen. So in the middle of nowhere, Russia sends a ship into the Irish Sea, right? And there are complications which are embedded in international law, which I will talk about in a minute, about, who has rights that is part of the territorial sea and who has rights in the economic zone, right? And these fishermen have rights to fish in this economic zone. And so they decided on their own that they were going to prevent this vessel from doing whatever it was doing, warfare, preparation, whatever, in their fishing waters. And this fleet was sent out, and in fact, the fleet managed to get the Russian boat out of that area. Well, what was the Russian boat doing there? Well, intelligence thought that one of the things they were thinking about was to cut a cable. There are cables under the oceans. And what do these cables do? They have all embedded in them all the communication links, in the case of the Irish Sea, between Europe and the United States. So had the Russians decided to go down there and cut the cable, there would have been for weeks probably, because there are no alternatives. There would have been a break between the normal communications, telecommunications, etc., between Europe and the United States. So a lot of these, we keep hearing about these pipelines, right, to bring gas, but there are also these pipes, whatever you want to call them, underneath the oceans, up in the North Sea, under, on the coast of Ireland and so forth, which are part of telecommunications, right? And if somebody has the capacity, which people think the Russians do, to have a ship and then have people go down there and cut these telecommunications links, that is potentially a new way of warfare, but it is a way of revolutionize what is happening in that world out there. So the problems here are fundamental and profound. And while we're talking about tanks and soldiers and so forth, which all sounds familiar, what we need to take into account is that the technologies that are out there have the capacity to proliferate because they're by and large in private hands, private companies' hands. They're also in the hands, when they are in the hands of governments, or there's a liaison between the government and some of these arms and tech companies, for example, in Israel and to some extent in the United States. They are a way of bringing governments and peoples to a heel, killing them, starving them to death, freezing them to death, doing whatever. And we haven't even gone in the past few minutes to satellites, right? The skies are full of satellites. And if you weaponize the satellites with nuclear satellites, we're no longer talking about traditional armies in uniforms, right? So I can't begin to tell you, A, how alarming this is, how it's changing international affairs, how it has to change international affairs, how the New York Times article, which goes into all kinds of detail, which you may or may not want to read about, is absolutely correct, and how interesting it is that a major newspaper in a popular Sunday magazine should write an article about this, because it is no longer, just a specialized, hidden kind of thing that we as citizens don't need to know about and think about and have something to say about it if we have electoral politics and have an impact on our legislatures, and on and on it goes. So this is something we need to inform ourselves and begin to have opinions. Now, we're sort of at the beginning of much of this, although we're not that much of the beginning of the Pegasus, and that all our telephones and so forth can be monitored. By the way, it is also the case, and I'm pretty sure this is accurate, that the FBI also has some capacity here and has maybe even bought into some of Pegasus. So theoretically, they can go after us if they want to. But I'm on not safe ground. I mean, I've read about this, and I'm assuming this is accurate. But it's absolutely accurate that this, army of authoritarian leaders have all purchased the software and are all now able to, to monitor their folks. And it's scary. I mean, civil liberties, democracies, when anything we say, you imagine a Trump coming back into power and deciding that the kinds of things that I might say to you or on the telephone to friends is actionable. And then you say, oh, well, don't be paranoid. But after all, we know that the election officials in Georgia were threatened with bombings and all kinds of things based on the positions that they took by simply being election people, normal citizens, right? Well, supposing their telephones were monitored and they, said things about a political figure, or said, that whatever they wanted to tell Aunt Martha, that might then become actionable and criminal, and on and on and on. Anyway, it is scary. It is very scary. And I think that one of the ways to calm our nerves in the first instance is to actually think and read about it, and not say, oh, well, I can barely make my cell phone work. What do I care about all of this? What I care about is, warfare and conflict and shootings and bombs and so forth, when in fact there is a totally different universe about this. Now, let me quickly move on to something historical, which might link into the contemporary as we move forward. Historically, technology often has driven international law as to what is appropriate behavior by states, especially states in conflict and warfare. For example, in the days of yore, when cannons were able to shoot for 3 miles, international law developed that the 3 miles that those cannons could shoot was part of your territorial sea and was therefore considered part of your territory, and that other countries' ships and so forth had no legal right without permission, right? So all kinds of law developed around that. Move forward to World War I, let's say, and gas was used. And then all kinds of international treaties and law developed against gas not being an acceptable mode of warfare. Why? Because it wasn't that enemy soldiers would be attacked, but also civilians, and civilians ought not to be the targets of warfare, because we used to think of warfare as, guys in red uniforms and blue uniforms fighting each other. Well, eventually, of course, with airplanes and bombers and so forth, it was hard always to tell who was who and what's what, especially for civilians. But civilians, the idea arose, civilians ought to be protected. After the Second World War and after the dropping of the US of the atomic weapons bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, eventually treaties developed between the United States and the Soviet Union about proliferation and all kinds of aspects of potential nuclear warfare. And then as nuclear capacity was developed in other countries, there was a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which meant that even other countries who developed nuclear capacity were bound by some of these limitations of use and monitoring and on and on. And also that, countries were not just willy-nilly supposed to add nuclear arsenals under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and so forth. So without boring you with the details of all these treaties, there were just a lot of treaties which had to do with the contemporary technological capacity coming out of conflicts and coming out of war, each time addressing the new technologies and trying to delimit harm to civilians and warning systems and treaties which supposedly safeguarded some of it. Now you can say that it's none of this has worked very well. On the other hand, we haven't had a nuclear conflict since the Second World War, right? The nuclear weapons haven't been used. It's also the case, of course, that countries like South Africa and once upon a time Libya and certainly Israel all have nuclear capacity without having admitted it. The South Africans admitted it after the end of apartheid and gave up their nuclear capacity. And the Libya gave up its nuclear capacity, and Israel still has it, even though it's not, formally acknowledged. So I'm not saying any of this is perfect, but certainly the attempts were made. So one of the things I think we need to move into and think about to what extent governments, be it NATO, be it the European Union, be it bilateral relationships, need to address is to what extent new treaties are necessary in order to try to get a hold of these new technologies, these cyber technologies, drones, and on, so that there's a kind of getting back to kind of a limited, if not profound, but at least limited control of addressing these new weapons and the harm that they can do accidentally on the one hand, but innocent civilians on the other hand. That hasn't moved forward yet. And I would predict that in the next decade, what needs to happen is that serious governments, and that includes Russia and China, as well as other players like North Korea, will have to sit down, not because of altruism towards others, but because of self-interest, because a lot of this can go so out of control that nobody wins, and nobody has enough control to win and control. By that, I mean in international affairs. In terms of national affairs, of course, that has to do with dictatorships and democracy and controlling your own population, and that's a separate ballgame. But I really do think that one of the things we need to think about in the next, we as citizens, but also states need to think about it, is that those countries that are at the forefront of having these technological capacities and this new way of fighting warfare will lead to, as the Times points out, new international relations. But part of the new international relations will have to be to think creatively how you bring some modicum of control over something, all this technology, which is now out of control and which could, blow up the universe, the climate, make life miserable for everybody, and be a veritable nightmare. So on the one hand, we know very little, we, the citizens. On the other hand, we better start learning things, which I'm delighted that the popular press is beginning to pick it up. And furthermore, we need to think about what we as citizens want our governments to do in order to rein some of this in. Obviously celebrate the commercial use and all the good things the chip industry does, all the good things that we get from our iPhones and all the rest. But at the same time, the weaponization of all of these things not only will change international relations, but international relations will have to address them in a way that everybody does not suffer from them, and reasonable actors in their national self-interest begin to do something about it. Anyway, lots to think about. See you again in 2 weeks. Thank you.